Our moral beliefs, dispositions, and intuitions were heavily shaped by evolutionary forces. Does this fact undermine our moral knowledge? Well, today I'm joined by Dr. Dan Korman and Noah McKay to explore this question and more. Maybe let's start with just giving a brief introduction to who you guys are and what you do, beginning with Dan and then Noah.
All right, great. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the invitation to do this. My name is Dan Korman. I'm at UC Santa Barbara, and my main interests are in material object metaphysics, and some parts of material object metaphysics led me to get really interested in these debunking arguments, first in the way they arose in that domain, and now mainly working in the meta-ethical debunking arguments, because that's where the literature is really the richest. And apart from that, I've got a number of side interests. I'm interested in the role of intuition in philosophy and philosophical methodology generally. I'm interested in social metaphysics and metaphysics of racial groups in particular.
I'm a PhD student in philosophy at Purdue University. I'm interested in epistemology, metaethics, and the metaphysics of mind. And I encountered evolutionary debunking arguments as an undergraduate, and I just thought this is such an exciting area of research.
For the audience, I've linked your guys' websites and lots of relevant work from both of you guys in the description. So for the audience, click down in the description. You can read their excellent papers, which I've linked down below. One of the main topics that we're talking about today is debunking arguments. So maybe, Dan, can you just tell us, what even are debunking arguments?
They come in so many different shapes and sizes, so this may not fit everything. Debunking arguments are usually arguments that try to convince you that there's something defective about certain of your beliefs, maybe your beliefs about morality, your beliefs about religion, your beliefs about the colors of objects, your beliefs about which middle-sized objects there are out there. And they try to do it by calling attention to something about the explanation of why you have these beliefs in the first place, either some sort of what seems like an irrelevant influence on those beliefs, some influence that seems to have nothing to do with the truths about that domain, or giving you reason to think that whatever explained the belief, it can't be the facts of the domain. These are abstract facts. Those aren't the sorts of things that can explain why you have the beliefs that you do. In the moral case, there's intense evolutionary pressure towards, forming the sorts of moral beliefs that would get us to protect our own or to cooperate. And once you realize that that's where your moral beliefs are coming from, your moral beliefs have natural selection's greasy fingerprints all over them, that should, for one reason or another, give you pause and either drive you to some sort of skepticism about morality, or push you towards a kind of meta-ethics that can accommodate that. Maybe some kind of anti-realism where we're responsible for generating those truths. But these arguments can arise in other domains. I mean, I think they're really familiar in philosophy of religion. Why is it that we have the religious beliefs that we do? It's because it makes us feel good. We're these creatures in this fearful world, and believing there's a higher order sort of calms us. We need that. It's a kind of wishful thinking. You don't find that in the serious literature, but there's a debunking argument. It doesn't try to show the beliefs are false, but it tries to, once you see where they're coming from, you shouldn't trust them.
Yeah. So I kind of am getting a sense that there are maybe two premises going on here, and then a conclusion that follows from them, as you sort of articulate it in your Philosophy Compass article, which I'll link in the description. One of them is maybe something like an explanatory premise or some sort of connection premise, like the relevant attitudes, like our beliefs about a particular domain, and that domain don't bear a particular kind of relation. Like they don't bear an explanatory relation to one another. They don't bear the right kind of maybe modal connection to one another, but they fail to bear some kind of relation to one another. That's the first premise. And then the second premise is an attitude or a belief bearing that relevant relation to that domain is needed for that belief to be justified or to be knowledge, or for you to in some way trust the belief, for it to have some sort of positive epistemic status. And from those, it follows that your belief is undermined. It doesn't have that positive epistemic status. It's either unjustified, or it's not knowledge, or you shouldn't trust it, or what have you. Is that a sort of fair summary?
I do think it's a fair summary of what I've just said. I've come to think that's how I had presented it, a while back in the Phil Compass paper. I've come to think there's a little more texture in the kind of basic skeleton of those arguments. I don't know if that's something I should say something about that right now, but I think that makes sense. You've got an explanatory premise and then a move from the explanatory claim to some sort of epistemic upshot. That's like a bare bones debunking argument.
Here's maybe one thing to note. Different debunking arguments aim at different conclusions, or they aim to challenge different views. Some of them just aim at particular first order moral beliefs, like the belief that we have a greater moral responsibility to those in our local community than to the wider world, for example. And then others aim at broader normative ethical views, like some utilitarians will argue with deontologists that, oh, your favored moral principles are debunked by this evolutionary explanation. And really, once you sort of eliminate the suspect beliefs, you're going to see that some egalitarian act consequentialism is the right way to go. Or you could aim an evolutionary debunking argument at a meta-ethical view, as Dan sort of gestured at. You might think that moral realism, in particular non-naturalist moral realism, the view that the moral facts are independent of us, they're sort of out there, they're kind of like mathematical facts. You might think that sort of meta-ethical view has a harder time explaining how evolution could have given us reliable moral faculties than other meta-ethical views. And so you might reject realism for that reason.
Maybe now let's really get into some of the main ways of fleshing out the argument. And maybe after we survey some of the main ways, we'll kind of camp out on one of Noah's favored and recent and new ways of running the argument. So I guess three main ways that come to my mind, I don't know if you guys have more, but are from explanatory considerations, modal considerations, and functional considerations. So Noah, maybe we'll turn over to you to just briefly give a survey of the range of ways of running the argument.
Yeah, good. So let's start with debunking arguments that invoke explanatory connections or a lack thereof. So the basic idea behind this sort of debunking argument is a belief is only justified, or it only constitutes knowledge, if it's explained in the right way by the facts that it's about. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated. You have to tweak the explanatory principle quite a bit to get it to work, in particular to handle some kinds of induction. But roughly the idea is you want your beliefs to be explained by the facts they're about. So if you believe that it's cold outside, you want that to be explained by the fact that it's cold outside, right? But then these debunking arguments say, well, moral facts just aren't the kinds of facts that could explain our moral judgments. One way of drawing this out is, well, imagine what an evolutionary story about our moral beliefs would sound like. If we told the whole story of the evolution of moral cognition, it doesn't seem like we would mention moral facts anywhere along the way. This is sort of the way that Richard Joyce puts it in his 2006 book, The Evolution of Morality. He says, you can tell the whole evolutionary story without ever mentioning any moral facts. But that sort of suggests that moral facts aren't playing a role in the explanation of our moral judgments. And so they're undermined. So that's sort of an explanationist debunking argument. And the other kind, the second kind you mentioned, is a modalist debunking argument. And there's some overlap between these, but the basic idea behind a modalist debunking argument is that, well, given the way our moral judgments originated, they're not modally robust, which means they're false in some epistemically relevant class of possible worlds. So there are generally two modal conditions that play a role in these arguments: safety and sensitivity. A belief is sensitive if, were it false, you wouldn't have it, basically. So if I believe it's cold outside, then my belief that it's cold outside is sensitive if, were it not cold outside, I wouldn't have that belief, right? And then a belief is safe if it couldn't easily have been wrong. Now, those are different, and explaining the difference might get a little bit technical. We can talk about that more if you want to later. But the basic idea is you want to look at all the nearby possible worlds, the nearby scenarios, and see, do your beliefs sort of cling on to the facts? Do they adhere to the facts across those nearby possible scenarios.
Yeah,
if
and
they
by
do-
nearby worlds or nearby scenarios, you just means ones that are very, very similar to the actual world, and in some way easily could have turned out to be the way that the world was.
Yeah, that's right. And so if your beliefs do sort of stick to the facts across those nearby possibilities, you're good. But if not, they don't. So that's the idea behind modal conditions on knowledge. Now, the modalist debunking argument is going to say, well, look, given that our moral judgments are heavily conditioned by evolution, they're not modally robust. So here's how a safety-based debunking argument might go. Well, evolution might have gone differently, and it easily might have gone differently. And the way we know is we can look around and we can see lots of animal species that engage in behaviors that by our lights are really awful, like infanticide and fratricide. And we think, ugh, like we're really lucky that we didn't evolve to be like that, or else our moral beliefs would have all been false. We would have thought that those ways of life were permissible. But then you stop and think, wait a second. That makes it seem like our moral judgments aren't robustly correlated with the moral facts. They're unsafe. They're modally insecure. And that means they don't constitute knowledge. And then the last kind you mentioned, what I call a Telic debunking argument, is based on the notion of function. And the idea is, well, if you find out that the function of a belief forming process isn't to yield truths, that gives you a reason to doubt the beliefs that it produces. And what evolutionary biologists have shown us is that the function of moral cognition, the function of the set of capacities and dispositions involved in forming moral judgments, isn't to yield truths. It's to do something else, like facilitate cooperation or attract sexual partners or maximize prudence over the course of a lifetime or something like that. And once you know that the function of moral cognition isn't to grasp truths, but to do this other thing, now you should be suspicious that its outputs are true. So these three different ways, they depend on subtly different epistemic principles, and which one you favor is going to depend a lot on which of those epistemic principles you think is most plausible.
Yeah, so before we camp out on your kind of Telic rendition, your Telic version, I was wondering if you wanted to say anything about these main ways of kind of running the argument, if you wanted to add anything to what he said.
One thing that really divides these approaches is what they think is like ultimately the problematic thing to recognize about your beliefs. And so, I think on all those different approaches, people might say, look, the moral facts, at least on a realist conception, the moral facts aren't the sorts of things that could be influencing your beliefs, causing you to have the beliefs that you do. And the explanationist says, and that's why you're doomed. That's why these moral beliefs, just that recognition in itself is what undermines those beliefs or undermines whatever view of the moral facts forced you to say that. On a modalist conception, they might start off the same way. They'd say, look, once you see that evolutionary forces are responsible for our beliefs, you see that, the moral facts have nothing to do with it. But that's not a problem in itself, that the moral facts aren't explaining your belief. It's that once you recognize that they aren't explaining your beliefs, you realize that you could easily have ended up with mistaken beliefs. They're unsafe. Or, you would have believed these things regardless of whether they were true. They're insensitive. And that's the damning thing. The Telic view, too, and we'll start by saying, look, the moral facts aren't having any causal influence on our moral beliefs or something along those lines, and then move from there to the conclusion that, because that's not necessarily bad in itself, the facts aren't explaining your beliefs, but at least in this case, that shows that it's not the function of this belief forming capacity to form true beliefs, and that's the damning thing. That actually has a major impact on what kinds of responses to the arguments are successful and which aren't, like what you think is ultimately the damning thing. Because the explanationist might at the end of the day say, yeah, the beliefs are unsafe, but that's not what undermines them. It's that there's this explanatory disconnect. That's one thing I'd want to add, a nuance that could end up being important.
these differences between the arguments might be especially salient later on when we're sort of canvassing or surveying at least some of the major predominant responses to debunking arguments. But maybe for now, let's turn to kind of Noah's Telic rendition and really just camp out on it. So, Noah, I know you gave a kind of preliminary gloss on it. I don't know if you want to flesh things out further. I don't know if you want to go through some of the main theories about, what explains, or like what the function is, the evolutionary function of our moral faculties. I don't know if you just want to flesh things out a little bit further so that we can dig into this deeper. I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll just kind of open it up for a back and forth on this sort of argument.
Here's how the argument goes. It's got 3 premises and a conclusion. And this is an argument. It's actually an argument for a conditional claim. Like I said earlier, debunking arguments can aim at lots of different conclusions. The conclusion I aim for is that if moral realism is true, then our moral beliefs are defeated. That is, they lack some important positive epistemic status. So they're unjustified or they fail to constitute knowledge. So if realism's true, then our moral judgments are defeated. And the premises go like this. If moral realism is true, then evolution is alethically indifferent to moral beliefs. And I can explain what alethic indifference is in more detail later, but the basic idea is evolution doesn't select for moral beliefs because they're true. That a moral belief is true doesn't make any causal difference to how evolution unfolds. That's the basic idea. Then second, I argue that if evolution is alethically indifferent to moral beliefs, then the function of moral cognition is not to grasp moral truths. And then the third premise is, if the function of moral cognition is not to grasp moral truths, then our moral beliefs are defeated. And from those 3 premises, you get the conclusion that if moral realism is true, then our moral beliefs are defeated. So I want to start not by defending each of the premises, but by giving an analogy that might help bring out the difference between this sort of debunking argument and the others. So suppose Temp, that's his name, and you'll see why in a second. Temp has been using a thermometer to measure the temperature outside his home. But one day he gets a visit from Barry. And Barry says to Temp, that's not a thermometer. That's a barometer. And the function of a barometer is not to measure the temperature, it's to measure the pressure. And Temp goes, oh no, I just learned that the readings on this device, they're not indicating facts about the temperature, they're indicating facts about the pressure. It seems like in that scenario, Temp's beliefs are undermined, they're defeated. He should give up his beliefs about the temperature outside his home because of what he learns about the function of the barometer. Now, this example, I think, can help us see how functional considerations, telic considerations, can come apart from explanatory and modal considerations. Let's start with explanatory considerations. Well, the problem isn't that the thermometer readings aren't explained by temperature facts, because there's a lawful relationship between pressure and temperature, right? The temperature of the atmosphere outside of Temp's home partly fixes the pressure. And then all sorts of facts about the temperature play a role in the internal functioning of the barometer. If you put the barometer on the surface of a star, it wouldn't function properly. It would just melt, right? So the complete causal story about the barometer's outputs would cite lots of facts about the temperature. So the problem doesn't seem to be that Temp's beliefs aren't explained by temperature facts. What about modal security? Is there reason to think that Temp's beliefs are modally insecure? Modal security is just safety and sensitivity. It means if this belief were false, you wouldn't have it, and you couldn't easily have been wrong about the temperature, right? So does Temp get evidence that his temperature beliefs are modally insecure? Well, he might, but he also might not. So we can imagine that Temp is a fatalist, and that means he thinks there's only one possible world. This also sometimes is called necessitarianism. And we can stipulate that Temp is justified in believing fatalism. He's got the best arguments for fatalism. Every philosopher he's ever talked to has said fatalism is true.
He's
Maybe
watched
God-
my video with Amy Karofsky, wherein Amy Karofsky gives a systematic defense of necessitarianism in one of her books.
Right. And he was rightly compelled by the reasoning. And so now he's a fatalist. Well, then it seems like when Temp learns that the barometer's function isn't to measure temperature, he doesn't thereby learn that his beliefs are modally insecure. Why? Well, because there are no nearby possibilities other than the actual one, right? So if Temp's beliefs are true, then they're modally secure. And so it also doesn't seem to be modal considerations that are defeating Temp's beliefs, or so I would argue. And so then I want to say it's the Telic considerations that are doing the work in this case. Now we could talk more about why Telic considerations defeat beliefs. I think there are multiple answers to that question, but I think that analogy sort of gives you a flavor for the way this approach differs from the explanationist and the modalist approaches. Maybe I'll stop there and see if either of you have thoughts.
Yeah, first thing I want to say, I just think this is great. I mean, I've been trying to sort all the different approaches into explanationist and modalist, and that's kind of colored all my thinking about these debunking arguments. And I think this is just a really new contender, thinking that the bottom line is that there's that you've just made this discovery about the function of moral beliefs. That's the damning revelation. That's the bottom line. And I think what you're alluding to is maybe it doesn't have to be the bottom line. Maybe it can be in virtue of something else, but just the availability of that sort of view, I think, is really interesting, illuminating for lots of reasons. And I love this. I love this way of trying to cause trouble for modal security. I have variations of it too, but I love this version where you just imagine that he's a fatalist. There just are no other worlds, and all you need to build in is that that's incredibly reasonable given whatever his philosophical education arguments that he's heard. I think that's
and when in doubt, just pull in an infallible oracle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's all you need sometimes to cause trouble for these security constraints. They're too easy to get around as long as you have kind of a really weird psychology. Yeah, so I thought that's great. Is it okay to poke a bit? And I definitely see how it handles this barometer case well, why modalism doesn't. So I'm sort of partial to explanationist approaches. I've had trouble hammering out exactly the details of the kind of explanationism I want to endorse, which might make me elusive in this. But I wonder if your attack only really engages with a very specific kind of explanationism. So definitely true. Like if someone can't explain why Temp is defeated in this case, that's a big problem. And the explanationist, I think, as you framed it, the explanationist is going to say, well, in order to be defeated by these sorts of explanatory revelations, what you need to be convinced of is that the facts of the domain don't explain your beliefs about the domain. And like you said, you don't have that because this person, at least knowing a little bit about how barometers work, knows that temperature facts have something to do with the readings. What are the units for barometers? If it's reading 30,
yeah, it'd be like atmospheres. But maybe we can stipulate that Temp's barometer had like the part of the screen where the units would display is like broken, so he thinks it says like Celsius or Fahrenheit or something.
Oh, sorry, but I was thinking. Sorry, no, I wasn't.
Right.
I mean, I was just thinking it just has numbers. It's just 30, and that's why he's so confused.
Right.
But let's say it says 30, and that's because it's 30 arrows out there, and he thinks it's 30 Celsius.
Mm-hmm.
And you're thinking, well, but still, temperature by his lights, temperature facts are going to be explaining the readings, and so he shouldn't be defeated by explanationist lights. But I was thinking once he learns that this is reporting barrows and not like the measurement, it's not saying that it's 30 Celsius. Then he shouldn't think that the fact that it's 30 Celsius, if it is a fact, is explaining his belief that it's 30 Celsius. And that's just because it's just a kind of a straightforward undercutting a testimonial justification. He thought he was being told by this barometer that it's 30 Celsius, but he's in fact being told that it's 30 baros.
So it sounds to me like the problem, as you're describing it, is that there's a very fine-grained fact that needs to be explaining the barometer's readings. Not just a fact about the temperature, but this very precise fact that the temperature is 30 degrees Celsius. And if Temp finds out that that fact isn't explaining the barometer's readings, then he shouldn't trust it. Is that the idea?
That's the idea, yeah. Formulate an explanationist principle that says something like, if you realize you believe that P for reasons having nothing to do with the fact that P, then you're defeated. As opposed to this more generalized one that says, if you become convinced that the truths of the domain aren't explaining your beliefs about the domain generally, then you're defeated. So it's that particularized one.
Yeah. So this is an interesting point. I wonder whether Temp really does learn that the barometer's reading isn't being explained by the fact that it's 30 degrees Celsius outside. And the reason I say that is because, well, I mean, for all Temp knows, it is 30 degrees Celsius outside. And if it is, then that fact is playing a causal role in the barometer's outputs. Maybe the problem is with the choice of example, because for any given temperature in Celsius, it's going to be relatively improbable, given your background information, that it's precisely that temperature. And so once your beliefs about the temperature are undermined, then you should go back to being really doubtful that the temperature is precisely that. But, maybe we could change the example to accommodate this problem. We could say, well, look, suppose that Temp lives in a place where the temperature fluctuates within a very narrow range. Yeah. Maybe it fluctuates between 29 and 31 degrees Celsius. And so then when Temp learns that it's a barometer, not a thermometer, he really doesn't learn that fine-grained fact that it's 30 degrees Celsius isn't playing a causal role in the barometer's outputs. But intuitively, Temp still loses his justification for thinking that it's 30 degrees Celsius when he finds out it's a barometer. Now he should be agnostic between 29, 30, and 31.
That's helpful. I'm going to keep thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, this is also really helpful. I'm thinking I should, and I don't know if the audience knows, but this is a paper I'm working on that Dan very, very graciously read in advance. So I'm going to have to, I think I'm going to have to update the example now to accommodate this sort of worry.
Oh, it's fantastic. This paper is so good.
I'm really glad.
Yeah.
That means a lot coming from you because I like your work. So.
Oh, mutual admiration society.
Right. Exactly. So I was wondering, like, could you push back on just that specific response by saying, like, well, that particular explanatory demand, that like the specific fact P that your belief is about needs to sort of explain your belief that P. Couldn't you just like pinpoint that, like, well, hey, this is precisely the sort of, explanationist principle which succumbs to the kind of induction worries and other sorts of worries, and like maybe you really do need to fall back on some more general principle, explanationist principle, where like, no, the facts that explain your belief really only need to be like in the general domain concerning what your belief is about. So I was wondering, that's what I was initially thinking you were going to go, but that's another possible response. I don't know if it works. You guys are the experts in this domain.
Yeah, maybe. So my gut reaction is to think it's not going to work, but let's see. So earlier I said that this really flat-footed explanationist principle has trouble with induction. So take, for instance, my belief that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Well, that belief seems justified, and I'd go so far as to say that I know the sun will rise tomorrow. Nevertheless, my belief that the sun will rise tomorrow isn't caused, it's not explained in any direct way by the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow, because that hasn't happened yet, right? You can't have this sort of explanatory connection between my belief now and events that haven't yet occurred. So it's implausible to say that my belief sun rises tomorrow is explained by that very fact. But there might be a more abstract explanatory connection between them. My belief that the sun will rise tomorrow is explained by the fact that the sun has risen every day for all of human history, right? And that fact makes it very, very, very probable that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Or you might say the very facts that explain why the sun has risen every day throughout all of human history are also the facts that explain the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? Maybe these are facts about like the distribution of matter in the solar system and gravity and so on and so forth. So what we have here is my belief and tomorrow's sunrise being explained by a third factor, by this same fact. And some explanationists think that's enough. Okay, so we could modify the explanationist principle that way to accommodate cases of induction, but it doesn't seem like there would be any problem with that kind of explanationist principle focusing on like fine-grained facts like the one Dan was bringing up earlier. Like, there's no problem with the demand being that the facts that explain my belief that the sun will rise tomorrow also explain that very fact. The sun will rise tomorrow. And, similarly, I don't know how this would work, but if there were a situation in which somehow there was a fact that explained my belief that it was 30 degrees Celsius, and that also made it the case that it was 30 degrees Celsius, yeah, that doesn't seem like it would be too stringent of a requirement for me. Is there like an example you have in mind where maybe the fine-grainedness of the relevant fact would cause trouble?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that directly. Can I just take a step back and think about the different forms of explanationism?
Yeah.
And we'll see if we can come back down to your what did you want to know, Noah? I mean, I think we've sort of gotten three different versions on the table here. One is the one I think you initially were targeting, which is it's if you realize that the fact that no facts from the domain explain your beliefs about that domain, then you're defeated. And there, that ended up being too weak because we could import, kind of some nondescript facts of the domain that have some role. And then a second sort of explanationist approach is to try to have a third factor explanation, kind of loosen things up, looser than what Joe was saying, which is, it's not that the fact believed has to explain the belief. It's enough that there be a common cause of some sort, and that'll loosen things up to make it induction friendly. Both of those are very induction friendly. But actually, yeah, Joe's exactly right. The principle, as I just articulated it, is going to lead straight to inductive skepticism. So I was saying, the belief that P has to be explained by the fact that P, and if you can't think that, then you're defeated. And there have been people who have tried to make the case that those explanatory connections hold that kind of backwards explanation. So, Bogardus and Perrin have this paper.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
something like knowledge is
believing something because it's true.
Because it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that paper. It's like a heroic defense of a really
It's a heroic
view.
It's a very heroic.
Yeah, my view is so I think that's too heroic for me. And I should add also, Carrie Jenkins has these examples of, I'm cleaning my house because my family's coming over tomorrow. Like there's some explanations citing future facts. So maybe we can warm up to Joe's skeptical. There's something funny going on with those examples, but
it's because I believe that they're coming or because they told me or something like that. But anyway,
I think the third factor explanations end up being way too weak, just like the temp case with the temp's fatalist. You can sort of, if you've got a weird enough psychology, you just squirm right out of, you can reason your way to those third factor explanations too easy. So I think that's not stringent enough. That kind of bare, it has to be the belief is explained by the associated fact is going to rule out induction, I think. So
yeah, I mean, if I can flesh out one of your points slightly further, I mean, I think under a kind of modal fatalism. So, like, some people within philosophy of religion think that like, God is identical to his acts, and he's identical to everything intrinsic to him. And a lot of people think that this entails a kind of modal collapse or necessitarianism. And some people who hold this kind of view of God actually embrace that, full-heartedly. And they are necessitarians, but they think that, like, all the facts apart from God are ultimately explained and traceable to God or his will or whatever. So God would almost in that case be serving as a third factor explanation. He would be explaining the relevant facts, and he would also be explaining your beliefs about those facts. You'd have safety, sensitivity, thereby security. You'd also have a third factor explanation, but it still seems like your belief is defeated in the case.
Yeah, there's a secular version of that too. So, Goldman, when he was laying out, something like this picture, causal constraint on knowledge and allowing third factors, well, the Big Bang ends up being a trivial third factor for everything. And so he makes things a little more stringent, like you have to be able to reconstruct some kind of causal chain, something like that. So there's variants of that, but so it becomes very easy to have a third factor. What I've defended in print, and I'm less sure about now, is a different kind of adjustment to say it's either got to be that the fact that P explains your belief that P, or some properly anchored facts, some beliefs, some properly anchored beliefs that Q that are explained by the facts that Q. Those have to support your belief that P. Your belief that P has to be inferred from them, or something like that. And that's more like what I was thinking might be able to handle the barometer case, but it's really tricky to get any bite out of that principle. Anyway, I have my reservations about it, but I've got a paper with Dustin Locke where we try to defend that version of explanationism, and I wonder if it'll be able to handle the barometer case. It's called Explanationist Accounts of Genealogical Defeat, something like that. It's published probably last year, the year before, in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research.
Awesome. It's linked in the description, everyone, so check it out. Okay, turning it over to Noah.
Yeah. So I was actually taking a look at that paper earlier today because I thought it might come up. And it's not clear to me it's going to handle the barometer case. So the principle says that in order for your belief that P to be justified, you've got to be entitled to think that the facts that explain it support P, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like that might be the sort of case that temp is in. So we've already granted that the relevant temperature facts causally explain the barometer's outputs. And there's another wrinkle in here too, because you said the facts that explain the belief and that the subject treats as reasons for the belief. But I think that condition's met here too. So because temp is treating the barometer's reading as a reason for his temperature beliefs. So we've got the temperature facts. They're causally explaining the barometer's readings. And those facts, the temperature facts, let's suppose it really is 30 degrees Celsius outside. Then those facts really do support the belief that it's 30 degrees Celsius outside. In fact, they entail it, right? So it seems to me like temp's temperature beliefs do meet that condition. And so it can't be a violation of the condition that explains why his beliefs are defeated. You look skeptical.
No, I'm worried. I'm going to think about that. That's a good, I see it. Because, from where he's standing, if he, he's thinking, well, it is 30 degrees Celsius, that it's 30 degrees Celsius is, explaining because temperature, affects air pressure. That's explaining why we have that pressure. And I'm just going to want to think more about it. There's other things I'm excited to ask you about. So, and I'd want to sort out my thoughts before I dig in more here. But
Let's turn to those.
One of the things I'm interested in with the Telic account, I wonder if it's going to be too easy to get Telic defeat in some weird cases, like swamp cases. So you have You have someone who was just
yes.
the lightning struck the swamp, and a molecule for molecule duplicate of Joe, comes out of the swamp and learns that this happened, and maybe also is just given a textbook about human perception and human perceptual systems. I'm not saying that Swamp Joe is human, but learns something about how the eyes work, and so can kind of have a sense of how Swamp Joe sort of has a sense of how he could have reliable sense experiences. But it looks like the Telic view is going to say, well, it can't be that the function of these perceptual experiences to track the truth, because there's no evolutionary history here to bestow a natural function on these experiences. And so it looks like by his lights, the function of his experiences are not to track the truth. And so he's all of his perceptual beliefs that he's been forming in the minutes since he came out of the swamp are defeated by his lights. And I think that's the wrong result. He can remain justified despite finding that out. So I just wonder what you think about those cases.
Well, if I could add, it might even be a little worse, even worse than that. I mean, like, because none of his faculties then have an evolutionarily bestowed function or purpose. So then, like, even Swamp Joe introspecting on a state of excruciating pain can even be justified in believing that he's in excruciating pain. I'm assuming that a molecule for molecule duplicate of me can be in excruciating pain. That seems quite plausible because it has the relevant brain structures, it has all that sort of stuff. So and that seems mistaken. It seems like someone in excruciating pain should be able to be justified in believing that they're in excruciating pain on the basis of kind of acquaintance with their pain. But the relevant faculty, the relevant introspective faculty, which subserves that belief, it does not have the function for producing truth, it seems. I mean, I guess, well, before we turn over to Noah, I was just thinking immediately, granted, the most popular accounts of function are like evolutionary historical accounts. But like one way you might try to go is to say like, maybe be a little bit more Aristotelian. Maybe say like, there's something about like the intrinsic nature of Swamp Joe's, eyes and the relevant organs that kind of explains them having a function in the moment without having kind of his evolutionary historical history. Now, I grant that that's a little bit spooky, but maybe that's one way that Noah could go. But I'll turn over to Noah.
Yeah, so I think there's so much to say about this case. So I'll talk about a bullet biting route and a non-bullet biting route. Let's start with the non-bullet biting route. I think Joe is right that the best move to make here might be to opt for a different account of functions, or perhaps to say that there's more than one way for a thing to have a function, and Swampman's cognitive faculties would have functions in one of those ways, at least like his introspective faculties and his sensory faculties. The most popular account of function in philosophy of biology is what's called the etiological account. That's the one that I assume in this paper. The etiological account says that the function of a mechanism is whatever it does that explains why it's around. So, for an example, the function of the heart is to pump blood. Why? Well, because that's what hearts do. That explains why there are hearts. We have hearts because they pump blood. And animals with hearts survive and reproduce because their blood circulates, and that underpins all their other physiological functions, right? But the trouble is that all that explains why Swampman's cognitive faculties are around is that a lightning bolt struck a puddle of mud or something like that, right? So it's not that the reliability of his cognitive faculties isn't what explains why he has them, and so that's not their etiological function. But there are other views of function, like there's I'm forgetting the precise name of this view, but it's the main rival to etiological accounts is something like an internal maintenance view, where it says the function of a mechanism in a system is whatever it does that contributes to the maintenance of the overall system. So that sort of view is still going to deliver the right result about the heart, right? What the heart does that contributes to the overall maintenance of the body is to pump blood. And maybe we can say that Swampman's cognitive faculties have that kind of function, because if Swampman wasn't able to do simple things like, sense trees or notice when he's in pain, he wouldn't be able to do much. He would very quickly break down, right? So that's one option that doesn't involve biting bullets that I really like. Now notice, I'm going to have my work cut out for me if that's the solution I adopt to the Swampman case, because then I'm going to have to give additional arguments for thinking that moral cognition doesn't have a function in that sense.
Right. That was going to be my question.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't have to say it doesn't have a function in that sense. I have to say that its function in that sense isn't to grasp moral truths.
Right.
I think I could do that, but maybe I'll leave that project for another time and talk about the bullet biting response, which is the one I actually think is right. The bullet biting response is just to say that Swampman is completely epistemically adrift. His beliefs have no valuable epistemic status at all. Okay, now I'm getting an incredulous stare, the infamous incredulous stare. But let me try to pump your intuitions a bit. And then, by the way, I'll give another sort of view that's sort of intermediate between this bullet biting view and the other one. Is a little bit more moderate, but I'll start with the crazy one. So, look, Swampman should just think to himself, oh my gosh, here I am. How did I come to be? I just popped into existence spontaneously. Was I designed by an agent who was aiming to produce a creature whose cognitive faculties would lead them to the truth? No. Were my cognitive faculties selected from the space of possible cognitive faculties by something like a selection process that was aiming at reliability? No. Well, then how on earth would my cognitive faculties have wound up being reliable? It doesn't seem like there's any answer to that question. I think Swampman is in the same epistemic position a Boltzmann brain would be in. So a Boltzmann brain, for the audience, if you've never heard of this before, is a brain that just spontaneously fluctuates out of the void, and complete with experiences, all these mental states, but it doesn't have a real history. Suppose you really think you're a Boltzmann brain. Should you think that your cognitive faculties are reliable? Well, I don't think so. I think if you're just sort of a little blip in the quantum vacuum, you should think, yeah, what are the odds that a random blip in the quantum vacuum? I mean, the fact that it's a brain makes things a little bit problematic because we've got all these background beliefs about brains and about how they function. But we'll just say a Boltzmann subject. So you don't know if you're organized the way a human brain is organized. All you know is that you just fluctuated spontaneously out of the quantum vacuum. It seems crazy for you to think that given that's the way you came about, your cognitive faculties are tracking the truth. And so I think Swampman should be a radical skeptic. But if you don't like that response, maybe here's something we could fall back on. Swampman doesn't have to doubt the reliability of all of his cognitive faculties, because there are some cognitive faculties whose status, whose trustworthiness just isn't open to evaluation. So you might be a Wittgensteinian who thinks that there are such things as hinge propositions. Those are propositions that you have to believe in order to be rational, and that means they're not subject to rational criticism. So an example might be the world didn't pop into existence fully formed 5 seconds ago. Maybe that's sort of, well, I don't know. I don't know if Wittgenstein would say that's a hinge belief, but maybe another hinge belief might be there's an external world, or I'm not radically deceived by a Cartesian demon, or something like that. These are beliefs that you just have to have in order to engage in any kind of rational belief formation at all. And perhaps we want to argue that Swampman is justified in believing that at least his like reasoning abilities, like the faculties he's using to reason about whether his other cognitive faculties are reliable, at least those cognitive faculties just aren't open to doubt, because it's just a hinge proposition for Swampman that those faculties are reliable. Then we can say, well, yeah, okay, maybe Swampman doesn't know absolutely nothing. And then maybe Swampman could, after a while, sort of reason his way to trusting the other cognitive faculties. Like maybe let's give him introspection too, because plausibly, if you don't know what beliefs you're currently thinking of, it's going to be hard to follow all the way through a logical inference, right? Unless you're actually aware of the steps in the argument you've already made, and that seems like it involves introspection. So let's grant him like domain general reasoning and introspection. Then maybe Swampman over the course of time can notice, hey, look, my experience and my beliefs cohere with each other. They nicely fit together. And that would be really weird if they weren't tracking the truth. And by the way, Lawrence Bonjour, the famous coherentist from the 1980s, this is sort of the way that he thought that agents like us actually do end up with justified beliefs. Even justified perceptual beliefs. It's on the basis of this idea that, well, look, we've got this body of beliefs. We notice that it's coherent, and then we just give an a priori argument for thinking that coherent sets of beliefs are likely to track truth over the long run. So as Swampman goes through the world and starts forming beliefs and having perceptions, he notices that they nicely cohere, and that gives him, and then he's got an a priori argument from there to the conclusion that his cognitive faculties are reliable. But importantly, he wouldn't have a similarly good argument, at least so I say, for thinking that that moral cognition was reliable. Okay, that was a lot. I just put like so much on the table, but those seem to me like three of the salient options.
Can I just respond to each of those quickly? I mean, I think I would. If I were you, I would lean hard into finding other ways for capacities to have functions. The first response, and you may be right. You're just going to be able to close that off. That's not going to help escape moral debunking. On the second one, let's say the third one. It sounds like what you're doing is sort of building a case. Hey, here's where the justification would come from for the Swampman, for Swamp Joe. But your principle of Telic defeat is going to keep sending them back to, but even if I can have a reason to think they're reliable, any reasons I have, any beliefs I have that are feeding into this are coming out of a capacity that doesn't have a function of truth tracking. I just came out of the swamp. So you just keep getting defeated. So there's a kind of common trope in the debunking literature. Yeah, fine. Let's say they're justified. The beliefs are justified in a coherentist way, foundationalist way, by intuitions, by experience, whatever you want. Now you get now you get the genealogical defeater. And in this case, it's the function. And so does that seem right, what I'm saying? That building up, finding a structure of justification won't be enough to resist Telic defeat, if you're right.
Yeah, good. So this is an excellent point. And this is sort of what I was getting at when I said we should think there are some propositions that are just immune to rational criticism for Swampman. The idea would be there are certain propositions that are just immune to any kind of defeat, including Telic defeat. So I'm going to have to restrict the Telic defeat principle to propositions that aren't hinge propositions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
then there's a live question about whether moral propositions are hinge propositions. And a Wittgensteinian might push back and say, hey, look, you want to be a rational agent, you got to have some values.
Pain is bad. I mean, seems kind
of. That's pretty. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
That won't work.
Yeah, but no, that's interesting. I wasn't seeing how the different parts were fitting together of the third response, but the key idea is to restrict the Telic defeat principle to exclude like outputs that are hinge propositions. Yeah.
I'm interested what you guys think about the Boltzmann subject case. Do you think that if you found out that you were just a spontaneous fluctuation out of the quantum vacuum, you should generally trust the beliefs that you find yourself holding?
Not most of them, I don't think. But that's kind of why I had Swamp Joe get a textbook on like the structure of his swamp brain and his swamp eyes. So in that case,
I was going to ask, do you think Swampman's in a position to form beliefs on the basis of reading the textbook? I mean, that's pretty.
Yeah, like imagine giving the Boltzmann brain a textbook or something. Like somehow you're
right.
able
Yeah.
to
Suppose
Yeah,
you.
no. Well, then, I mean, I think if the Boltzmann brain were given, accurate information from a trusted source about the structure of the brain, so in such a way, this is the key thing, such a way that it wouldn't be reliability would not be inexplicable. They've now got enough information to just explain how they could be having reliable beliefs. I mean, the brain doesn't have eyes, I guess, but Swamp Joe does. So I like things, so it has an explanation of the reliability there, and that's the sort of thing that could, I think, that should play some role in saving him from defeat. It's not. I mean, there might be no explanation. It's nothing more than a coincidence that lightning struck the swamp and he got eyes like this. But seeing what the eyes are, the eye-like things are like, what the brain-like thing is like, it's perfectly clear how there could be reliable experiences and reliable beliefs about at least middle-sized objects. That's what I was thinking. That's the main way I wanted to push back on the bullet biting move. He might have no explanation of how, no explanation beyond saying it's a coincidence that he got such good organs.
But isn't that a crazy thing for Swampman to believe? That just by coincidence, he wound up with cognitive faculties that track the truth just as well as human cognitive faculties? I mean, seems like the prior probability of that happening is just insanely low. Maybe here's a let me see what you think about this case. Introduce Boltzmann Swampman. Boltzmann Swampman is not an actual Swampman. He's just sort of he's just a fluctuation out of the quantum vacuum. Maybe he's just a little clump of brain matter with just enough neurons to give him a brief glimpse into what he thinks is his life as a Swampman.
Yeah.
But really, he's not a Swampman. But he's got all the same internal evidence that Swampman has in the case you described. But then he finds out, of course, he doesn't know his cognitive faculties are reliable in this case, because by stipulation they're not, right? He believes that he's Swampman, but that's false. Well, I don't know. So suppose, is Boltzmann Swampman justified in thinking that he's that his faculties are reliable?
Well, I was thinking so, but I'm starting to feel the force of what you're saying, Noah. So here's just go back to Swamp Joe. That might be enough to say what's to say my piece here. So you go back to Swamp Joe. He's just learned all this crazy stuff. Lightning struck a swamp, and this completely improbable thing happened. This extremely improbable thing that would have given me reliable belief for it. Probably something's gone wrong in the calculations here. Probably something's gone wrong. So I think one sort of response I want to give is sometimes coincidences happen, and you can see that they happen. You can see something really crazy happened. I flipped the coin 100 times. It came up heads 100 times, and it's but when it's something, maybe your point is that when it's something so unbelievably, massively improbable, the thing to do is not believe your eyes and think, well, a coincidence occurred. Think just something's deeply wrong with the whole system here. I can't trust my perceptual experiences. I can't trust the textbook. I can't trust something is off. Maybe that's the idea. I can that.
I think what's worrying about the sort of coincidence Swampman's got to believe in order to be justified in thinking his faculties are reliable is that if that coincidence didn't happen, then he's massively deceived about everything. Or maybe not, but his beliefs don't have any positive epistemic status. In the case where you see a coin come up heads 100 times, I mean, there could be lots of explanations for that. Maybe the coin is weighted. Maybe someone's playing a trick on you, or maybe just a really improbable event occurred. But none of those explanations do anything to threaten the faculties you used to form your belief that that the coin came up heads 100 times. That you have all all this background reason to trust your visual faculties in that scenario. And what happens to the coin doesn't really affect your assessment of the reliability of those faculties. And so then I think there's no worry. Although maybe what you should think, if you see 100 coins come up heads, maybe you should think that you're dreaming.
Yeah. But that's the sort of thing I was just thinking about now when I said I'm feeling the force of what you're saying. I mean, it's the equivalent of having just learned that, that a fair coin flipped 1 billion times, came up heads every time. You're like, well, maybe I'm just tripping. Like maybe that's what Swamp Joe should think. Yeah, good.
Well, Dan, do you have any other ways that you wanted to push back on, or just at least probe the?
There's one thing I really wanted to ask about, and it's something you addressed in the paper, and I just kind of want to poke around a little bit at this. So, one thing you someone might say is the natural function of moral, of our moral belief forming capacities. The natural function is not to track the truth, but we can give it a new function.
Mm-hmm.
This is the part I want to talk about. For instance, I can say, "Oh, I see. The function of this is just to, help make me cooperate and protect my children when I really don't want to." That's the function of these moral beliefs and moral capacity. But I want to give it a new function, and the new function is going to be to discern the moral truth, and that's something you can do. You can give something a new function it didn't have before by starting to use it in that way. So that's first, opening salvo. And if I do that, well, now I'm immune from Telic defeat. So I think I know what you're going to say, but I want you to say it.
I think the right thing to say here is we can give a mechanism a new function if it's already able to perform that function independently, and we just haven't used it for that yet. So the example I give in the paper is the cavity magnetron, which is a device that emits microwaves. It was originally invented for use in radar systems, but people pretty quickly figured out that microwaves have lots of other really useful applications. Like you can use them to cook your food, and you can use them to accelerate particles. And they put them to those new uses. And now the function of the cavity magnetron is to cook food or to accelerate particles, right? And we can assimilate this to the etiological account of function. We can say, well, look, the reason the cavity magnetron was around when it was first invented was because it was useful for radar. But the reason there are so many cavity magnetrons around now is because they're really useful for cooking food and accelerating particles. And maybe you could say something similar for moral cognition. We started using moral cognition for this other thing because it was useful for that. And now that's the reason why it's around. Here's why I don't think that response is going to work. When the cavity magnetron was invented, it was the only device that could emit microwaves, right? You couldn't pick up any old device and use it to cook your food or accelerate particles. It's very, very unusual for something that's designed for one function to just so happen to be suited to some other totally different function, right? The cavity magnetron is a cool example precisely because it's an exception to that general rule. So in order for us to put moral cognition to this new function of grasping moral truths, it's got to already be capable of doing that. It has to already reliably track the moral truths, but that's precisely what it probably can't do if that's not its natural function, if that's not what it evolved for. That would be like finding out that even though the function of the lungs is to breathe air, they're also useful for breathing underwater. Or even though the function of ears is to hear, they're also useful for flying. And maybe another example that might be helpful is like, suppose you're planning a trip with a friend of yours to go hunt for treasure, buried treasure at the beach. And you show up and you're like, "Did you bring the metal detectors?" And he said, "No, but it's okay. I got this broom." And you say, "What? How is that gonna?" He's like, "No. You're like," and I say, "A broom is for sweeping, not finding buried treasure." And he says, "No, but it's fine. Look, we can put the broom to this new function of finding buried treasure. And I rightly look at him and I say, that's nuts. Because the broom, I mean, there's no reason, antecedent reason to think that the broom is going to be good at finding buried treasure. That's sort of an absurd example because we in fact know that it's not good for that. But yeah.
So I want to put some pressure right there.
Okay.
We don't have antecedent knowledge. Well, I do agree with that about the broom. We don't have antecedent knowledge that our moral capacities aren't tracking the truth. But what Telic defeat is supposed to do is undermine any of the deliverances of your moral capacities, including any that you might use to try to bootstrap your way up to the conclusion that that the capacities are reliable. But now, suppose I've given it this new function. I try to give it this new function. You come along just like you did, and you said, well, you can only have successfully given it that new function if it's able to track the truth. And then I say, oh, good point. Let me check if it is able to track the truth. And now I'm going to do some third factoring. I'm going to say, survival is good, and promoting survival is a good thing, morally good thing. And look, these things that I think are morally good are exactly the things that promote survival, or in large part. I mean, there's exceptions, and promote cooperation. And so those are good things. And so it actually looks like all along our moral capacities have been tracking the moral truth. And you can't now come along and say, but look, you're relying on a moral belief which has been defeated, the belief that survival is good and cooperation is good. And I say, how has it been defeated? And you're going to say, well, because its function isn't to track the truth. I said, no. That's the new function it's been given, is to track the truth.
So I'll give a case and then explain why, maybe this case is oversimplified, but I think it'll sort of prime the pump for you to see the sort of response I'm going to give. Imagine I told you that broom doesn't have the function of searching for buried treasure. And you say, well, I just gave it that function. And I reply by saying, well, you can't do that unless it can find buried treasure, but it can't. And you say, oh, can't it? And you move it across the sand and you go beep, 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 beep. And then you say, oh, look, there's some buried treasure right there. And what do you know? The broom located it. I shouldn't find that convincing, and neither should you, because you're just assuming precisely what you set out to show, namely that the broom is able to find buried treasure. Now, maybe that's oversimplified, because in the case you described, it's not that straightforwardly question begging, because what you're doing is providing an explanation of how moral cognition lined up with the moral truths. And I don't have anything like that in the broom case. If you ask me, how is the broom, or how did the broom come to be such a reliable metal detector, I'm not going to have a good story to tell. But I think even with that modification, the response is question begging in a subtler way. It's like the broom case, but less obviously. So let's think back to Temp. So suppose Temp gets a visit from Barry as before and learns that the barometer isn't meant to measure temperature. But then he says to Barry, hey, why don't we put it to the new use of measuring temperature? Wouldn't that be great? And Barry says, I don't think that's going to work. That's not a good idea unless it's already tracking the temperature. But we shouldn't think that it is, because that's not its function, or that's not its original function, at least. And then Temp says, well, okay, let me take some measurements. So Temp takes some pressure measurements with his barometer, and then he takes some temperature measurements with the barometer. And he notices that these measurements are related by a very simple equation. Pressure equals temperature. Okay, now he's got a theory. He's got a theory of temperature. Namely, it's exactly equal to the pressure. And he goes back to Barry and he says, look, based on my measurements, I've got a theory that explains the reliability of my barometer. It turns out that temperature and pressure are always equal. And so any device that reliably correlates with that reliably measures the pressure is going to reliably measure the temperature. And so now we've got a theoretical justification for trusting the barometer's readings with respect to temperature. And then Barry says, that's dubious. And the reason why is because this theoretical justification that you've given just depends on the assumption that the barometer reliably measures the temperature, but that's not something you're entitled to assume, given that you've got a Telic defeater. So the analog in your case would be, oh, well, look, human survival and reproduction are at least somewhat good. Like, this is the sort of line David Enoch takes. And so it's not surprising that evolution would push us in the direction of true moral beliefs, because it wants us to have beliefs that promote human survival and reproduction. I think that the criticism is analogous to Barry's. It's that premise that human survival and reproduction is at least somewhat good, that's suspect given the Telic defeater. So this kind of theoretical justification is ultimately question begging. Now, I don't want to say that third factor responses, like the one we just described, Enoch's, fail in every situation. It's really tricky. Evaluating third factor replies is super hard. And I think there are some debunking arguments that are vulnerable to them, but I don't think the Telic debunking argument is. I think third factor theorists who offer those sorts of replies to the Telic debunking argument they're making the same mistake that Temp is making when he gives this theoretical justification to Barry.
Yeah. So I think I agree with that for the most part. So the reason that the third factor reply fails is because they've got a Telic defeater for one of the assumptions that they're arguing from. And so it's not about begging questions. It's that one of the beliefs they're reasoning from has already been defeated by their concession about the function. And so that's why I'm so interested in the idea that we might bestow something with a new function. And once you've done that, it's not clear to me that you can get a Telic defeater. And I totally agree with you that Temp's reasoning, in that straight up bootstrapping case, there's something very wrong with it. And it probably isn't that bootstrapping is wrong in principle, but that's another discussion. But there's something very wrong with it. But again, it can't be that it's a Telic defeater if he's given it this new function. It must be some other defeater, maybe an explanationist defeater. So I think you can get me to admit something's gone very wrong there. I don't think it can just be that, questions are being begged, because once you start wheeling in constraints, you can't beg the question, you can't assume something that your opponents are trying to challenge, you can't, accept something that you don't have independent reason to believe. I mean, you're doomed. I mean, that's just the road to just global skepticism. I think there's a whole debate to be had there. So I guess here's how I'd want to think about it. And I think we need to anyway, here's how I'd want to think about it. Something's gone very wrong in that sort of reasoning, the give it a new function reasoning, but it can't be accounted for in terms of Telic defeat, and it can't be accounted for in terms of question begging. And so it'll have to be by some sort of explanationist constraint. The problem is that still, by your lights, the moral facts aren't playing any role in explaining the moral beliefs, even if you've given it this new function, and then you've undercut it. Anyway, that's how I want to get explanationism back in the story here.
Okay, yeah. So I agree that maybe it's a little hasty to call this sort of mistake begging the question. It's really hard to say what begging the question is, but maybe we should leave that terminology aside and say, okay, so what I'll want to say if I'm defending the Telic debunking argument, and if I'm trying to maintain that it's independent of the explanationist debunking argument, then I'll have to say the Telic defeater that Temp gets initially is still doing the defeating. When he's trying to come up with this theoretical justification, that defeater is somehow still in force, and there's just no way for him to get around it. I wonder why it's not still in force. So maybe we can think about this like in terms of a timeline. So Temp gets his initial Telic defeater, right? So he finds out that the function of the barometer isn't to measure the temperature. And now he's in a bad position epistemically. Unless and until he can show that the barometer's got this other function, or unless and until he can give it this new function, his belief remains defeated. Well, now I think what we should say is that when temp tries to give the barometer the function of measuring temperature, he just fails because the barometer can't do that. This would be like trying to give a broom the function of being a metal detector. Even if you try to give it that function, you're simply going to fail. And the ideological account explains why. So remember, in order for something on the ideological account, a thing's function is what it does that explains why it's still around, or maybe in the case of an artifact, that explains why it's still being used. But in the case where I try to use the broom as a metal detector, it's not the case that I'm using the broom because it's detecting metal. I shouldn't believe that, right? Given that I already have very powerful reasons to think that it can't detect metal. And I think Temp's in a similar case with his barometer. Once he gets his first Telic defeater, what he should think is, this thing can't measure temperature, so I can't give it that function. And then, okay, so now we got three cases: the broom case, the barometer case, and the moral cognition case. And what we should think is something similar. Once we find out that the natural function of moral cognition isn't to grasp truth, we should think we can't give it that function because it can't do that.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of where it stops. It's like we never actually succeed in imparting the new function because this Telic defeater is getting in the way. It's preventing us from justifiably believing that the mechanism can do this thing that we want to use it for. Does that seem more plausible?
Yeah. Most importantly, it's not that we haven't given it the new function, but you can't think you've given it a new function.
Yeah, that's right. You wouldn't be justified in thinking that it had that function, even if you tried to give it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd be interested too, because I don't know how long we want to linger on this. I'd be interested in exploring a case where someone who'd never thought about evolution of moral cognition, never thought about the function, didn't possess a Telic defeater yet, gives it a new function, or suspects it also has this function of tracking the truth, and then is given this whole evolutionary history, and whether they can now, starting from the first time, under this assumption, which might end up being undermined, that it's had this new function, whether they can reason their way. But now we're really splitting hairs. So this is great.
Like, maybe briefly, Noah, I'm interested in so I'll first turn it over to Dan to explain maybe his kind of general favored approach, or at least the approach to which he's most sympathetic in responding to, I guess, debunking arguments more generally, but maybe like explanationist ones that might worry Dan the most. I'll turn over to him first to explain the kind of constitutive view. Very briefly, because we've only got 5-10ish minutes, and then Noah, I'm interested maybe in like one of your main difficulties with the account, and then we'll let Dan have the final word, and then we'll close it out. So Dan, what is this response, and then we'll turn it over to Noah.
The basic idea, I should say, I feel like explanationist debunking arguments that are run on some sort of explanationist principle are very, very serious arguments for very serious skepticism. And I think they demand a big response, not these kind of sneaky third factor modalist responses. And the response that I hope is correct is the sort that John Bankson develops in his paper, Grasping the Third Realm. And the basic idea is this: there's got to be some account of our, in his case, it's, the non-accidental accuracy of our philosophical intuitions, mathematical beliefs, but this could extend to moral beliefs. If we're going to avoid skepticism, there's got to be some explanation in terms of the facts themselves. Unlikely that it's going to be a causal explanation. It's hard to see how these sorts of abstract facts, at least, as the realist thinks about them, are going to do it. But there might be room for a constitutive explanation, an explanation in terms of the intuitions, the moral intuitions, the philosophical intuitions, mathematical intuitions being constituted by the relevant facts, and that contributing in some way to explaining how we're right about these things. In some sense, it's right there in your experience. The fact is right there in your intuition. And, Bankson really tries to make the case that this is, constitution's a familiar relation for philosophers. And so this isn't just a mystical appeal to somehow we are apprehending these things. It's a constitution relation modeled on what you get from philosophers of perception. Some of them saying our experience is constituted by the world. The world itself is a constituent of the experience, contributes to individuating the experience. I'm not sure it's going to work in the end, but that's the sort of view that I am attracted to and very much hope is correct.
Noah, what's your sort of biggest worry for that?
Yeah, well, so let me start by saying that paper, Grasping the Third Realm, is one of my favorite epistemology papers. So I'm broadly sympathetic to Bankson's project, but here's a worry that I have about it. I'm not sure it can account for cases of intellectual hallucination. Let me explain what I mean by that. So Bankson gives a case where Ramanujan, the mathematical prodigy, sees a taxi cab with the number 1728 on it. And immediately he sees that this number has a very unique mathematical property. I think it's something like, it's the smallest number that's the sum of two cubes in two different ways. Now, suppose that seems like a genuine intuition. So the fact that 1728 has that mathematical property on Bankson's view is a constituent of Ramanujan's intuition, and that's why I can give him knowledge. But suppose I'm standing next to Ramanujan and I see the cap and it says 1728. And I just sort of have this impression that, oh my gosh, that number is the smallest number that's the sum of two cubes in two different ways. So it seems to me like that's true. But I'm not a mathematically competent person. My mathematical intuition isn't generally reliable. This is just a fluke. So that's an example of an intellectual hallucination. It's an intuition that happens to be true, but it's not like a genuine. It's sort of like a perceptual hallucination. You're not genuinely seeing the fact. You just got lucky.
Yeah, it's a veridical hallucination.
Exactly. Yes, that's right. A veridical intellectual hallucination, and the veridical part is gonna matter here. The analog of Bankson's view, as Dan was just saying, is naive realism about perception, which is the idea that our perceptions put us in touch with the world by being partly constituted by the world. Now, philosophers of perception who are naive realists have a really easy way to explain why objects in the world sometimes do and sometimes don't constitute our perceptions. They constitute our perceptions when they're causally related in the right way to those perceptions. That allows us to tell a story about what makes the difference between a genuine perception and a veridical perceptual hallucination. But it seems like the intuitionist is not going to be able to go that route. They're not going to be able to explain why my intuition is a hallucination while Ramanujan's isn't, by saying that this mathematical fact caused Ramanujan's intuition, but it didn't cause mine. Because like Bankson is defending a version of Platonism, which says that abstract mathematical facts like this, they can't cause anything. And so I just wonder, I think in order for the view to be plausible, it's got to be able to account for veridical intellectual hallucinations. And I'm just not sure Bankson's view can do that.
That's interesting. So what you want is an explanation. So, these cases are drawn from his paper, and he puts them to use to try to say the modalist can't account for the difference between the veridical hallucination and the mathematical geniuses.
Yes.
And what you want to say is there's an explanation that Bankson owes us, that I owe if I'm going to defend this view, of why is it that Ramanujan, is that it? Ramanujan has an intuition that's constituted by the fact, and the noob has an intuition that isn't constituted by the fact.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a good question. My recollection is that at the very end of the paper, Bankson tries to give an answer to something like that, and he gives this very mundane answer that may not satisfy you, which is something like, well, how is it that Ramanujan managed to have a constituted intuition, a non-accidentally accurate one? Well, by, being attentive, sober, free of, brain lesions, like in the case of the person who's suddenly has this intuition. I mean, that 1789 is the smallest number, sum of whatever it is. I'd want to take a closer look at what he says there to see if it addresses the question as you're asking it, which seems like an important question, and one that can be answered. This is what you were emphasizing, that can be answered in the perceptual case. How is it that the one person but not the other ended up with a constituted experience? Well, by being appropriately causally related. That's not what you're going to get in the case of good and bad intuitions, accidental and non-accidental intuitions. So that's a good challenge. Yeah. I'll add it to the list.
Yeah, we're going to wrap it up there.
Yeah.
Thank you guys both for coming on. I guess, like, any final concluding comments? We'll start with Noah. Just if you have anything to say, if you have a soliloquy prepared, now is the time. But
I had a great time, and I'm really grateful, Joe, that you invited me, and Dan, that you were willing to participate. This was just a blast. And let all bow before the majesty of reason.
Yes. And then any concluding comments from Dan?
This was just fantastic. I had such a great time reading Noah's paper. I read some of his other work. It's just fantastic. And I just want to emphasize, I think this Telic view is just so important to have on the table alongside the explanationist and modalist accounts. I think it does it sort of illuminates some of what's going on with Joyce as well. Because for Joyce, anyway, we should get into it. These are concluding thoughts. I think it's really illuminating. It was so helpful seeing it laid out as, this is another account of what's fundamentally going on with genealogical defeat. I just think that's great. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the conversation.
Audience, if you enjoyed that conversation, and if you've made it this far, you probably see value in the work that I do. So, of course, smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications, and consider supporting me on Patreon or through a one-time donation. Links to those are in the description. They are helping me through grad school and pay rent and all that sort of stuff. So much love to all my existing patrons. And, of course, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.